36, the 60-vote threshold having been achieved, the bill is passed.
6 months of saga, days of dealing, averting what would have been the first ever U.S. debt default.
The final vote in both chambers was overwhelming, far more bipartisan than anyone thought was possible.
The deal freezes non-defense budgets for 2024, followed by a 1% rise the following year and no budget caps after 2025. But defense spending would increase to $886 billion, which amounts to a 3% rise on this year.
Both sides operated in good faith. Both sides kept their word.
Cutting it close, but able to deliver. Still, there is a sign the last-minute deal carries a cost. There are much bigger problems that Washington is facing, from political divide on both sides, high inflation, a comeback of debt ceiling issue in 2 years, all the way to rising financial problems in the world. Hello and welcome to this special edition of Biz Talk. I'm Guan Xin in Beijing. The recent debt limit debate in the U.S. has raised serious concerns about fiscal sustainability and stability of the financial system. While a default was averted, the protracted political brinkmanship has likely dented confidence in the safety of U.S. treasuries as a risk-free asset anchoring global markets. At the same time, surging U.S. debt levels pose risks to the dollar and inflation outlook. Has confidence in the U.S. treasuries been impaired? What are the implications for global economy? Joining me today are two distinguished guests, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, one of the world's leading experts on economics and global development, director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, and a senior advisor to the UN. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a great pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much.
And Professor Li Daokui, a leading Chinese economist, director of the Academic Center for Chinese Economic Practice and Thinking at the Tsinghua University, and he's also a policy advisor to the Chinese government. Welcome to the show, Professor Li.
It's my pleasure.
So the U.S. narrowly averted a historic default before the June 5th deadline. The world economy has also been spared a huge shock. But has the debt deal substantively addressed the risks to the U.S. fiscal sustainability or simply kicked the can down the road? Professor Sachs, as one of the world's foremost experts on economics and crisis prevention, what is your assessment of the deal?
This is more kicking the can down the road. Nothing fundamental was settled. There was a lot of theatrics in this, kind of a political show, because there really wasn't going to be a default. In fact, even the political divide between the Republicans and the Democrats is exaggerated. The basic problem in the United States is, well, the rich people don't want to pay taxes, the companies don't want to pay taxes, the US government wants to spend a huge amount on wars and military, and this has been going on for quite a long time. So because of low taxes, high military spending, we have a debt that continues to rise as a proportion of the national income. It was about 35% of our national income back in the year 2000. Now it's 95% of our national income. It will be well above 100% of our national income within a decade. And our political system is not addressing this at all. It's making minor adjustments, but there was no debate on taxes at all because neither political party wants to do anything about taxes. There was really no recognition of the need for more social spending, even though we have a social crisis in the United States, and both political parties wanted to spend more on the military. So this is kicking the can down the road with a lot of theatrics around it.
Well, As you mentioned, the military spending, which is also a concern for China because it caps non-military spending but maintains a very high defense budget, which is larger than the next 10 countries combined. And we know one of the key objectives of the Pentagon is to deter China. How do you make sense of it?
Well, the United States is spending 3 times what China spends on the military, and as you say, more than the next 10 countries combined. I think it's a waste of money. I think if the US and China sat down and negotiated over arms control, we would save a lot of money and be much better for the whole world. This is part of the US problem right now, which is that US politicians think that military spending, even wars, because we've had many expensive wars in the last 20 years, is somehow good for the United States. But of course, it's not good for the United States. It's a complete waste of money, and it's on the wrong track, in my opinion. We need diplomacy, we need arms control, not this arms race, but this is American politics right now.
Professor Li, what is your comment on this point? And we know that Japan and China are the 2 largest holders of U.S. treasuries, and they are at least willing to see that the U.S. would default. Is it a relief?
Well, it is certainly a relief because China not only is a big holder of U.S. Treasury bill, but also China is a stakeholder of the international financial system, of which the U.S. still is at the center. Let's face it. So I would say that a big sign of relief can be heard in China with the passing of the bill right now in the U.S. Congress. Even though for the time being it is only a temporary solution, as Jeff just mentioned. In order to resolve the issue, I fully agree with Jeff. Fundamentally, the U.S. needs kind of a social political reform in changing its budgetary process. Okay, I often argue that somehow the U.S. budgetary process should take lessons from its central banking. Okay, in central banking, more or less, overall, I would argue. I mean, this might be controversial. Overall, the U.S. Federal Reserve manages its monetary policy much better than the U.S. federal government managing its budget, because the U.S. Fed is relatively independent of the federal government and relatively independent of politics. So in China, I'm working with scholars like Jeff Sachs. We established a society called Society for the Analysis of Government and Economics, registered in London. We're trying to push for reforms of the government in the economy, trying to resolve such issues like budget deficit and debt savings.
Professor Sachs, do you think reforms are necessary? And we know that the U.S. Congressional Budget Office projects interest payments may reach $600 billion this year and $1.4 trillion in 2033. What is your overall view on the sustainability of U.S. debt at this level?
The Congressional Budget Office makes a forecast for the next 30 years. And so they make a forecast to the year 2052, actually, most recently. And they show the debt rising to 185% of the national income if we continue on the current policies. Why? Because people are getting older in the United States, so there's more pension payments, healthcare is expensive, and we don't have a political consensus at all on how to address this. And as David just said, what's missing is a more fundamental consensus, even a longer-term vision, because you notice the politics are very short-term. This agreement covers 2 years. There was no discussion about the long term, none. And there was no serious attempt to look at a long-term solution. This is the problem with the U.S. politics right now at a deeper level. Our political system, in my opinion, has become highly corrupt because of the big monetary contributions of billionaires and corporations. So those big campaign contributors say, give us tax cuts, and that's what Congress does. And then there's not enough money to spend on important things like education or modernization of infrastructure. So the public suffers that way. But then the politicians like war more than they like diplomacy, which is another failure of the American politics. So the end result is large budget deficits that don't really get solved. And we need a deeper understanding of this. We don't even have a public debate about it, much less a consensus. So this idea of looking for a real deeper understanding is important. We don't have a long-term process in U.S. politics right now. And even though we have agencies like the Congressional Budget Office, which give forecasts, that doesn't turn into practical politics.
So, Professor Li, you talked about changes needed, but without meaningful reforms, how seriously do surging deficits and debt servicing costs threaten the economy going forward?
Well, in my view, it's more serious than most people have realized. Why do I argue that? The reason is that there are many economies, such as the Chinese economy, the Indian economies, which are emerging. And with the emergence of such new economies, let's call them new market economies, they are also providing financial securities or financial products, such as their own treasury bill, their own national sovereign debt, which are becoming increasingly possible to provide alternatives to the U.S. Treasury bill, right? So if I do worry, I worry quite a bit. I worry more than many of my American friends that these emerging market economies may come up with increasingly attractive financial instruments, so that international investors may one day down the road suddenly realize that why not we switch to the RMB debt or Indian debt. When that moment comes, we will see a tremendous financial crisis, the mother of all financial crises, much more severe than 2008 financial crisis. Now, don't get me wrong. I pray this day would not come, because when it comes, there's no winners. There's no, including the Chinese economy. There will be a chaos. So Jeff, I don't know how worried you are. I am very worried. There are people in China pushing for internationalization of RMB. I say I'm supportive of internationalization of RMB, but let's be careful. I worry about a sudden switch from the US dollar to other currencies so that everybody will lose. Okay, I hope the process will be properly managed.
Indeed. So, Professor Sachs, you mentioned the deadlock in the U.S. politics. The increasing political partisanship may have harmed the position of the United States in the world. As one of the leading global development economists, do you have any suggestions to how to find an off-ramp from this?
Well, first of all, it's not really partisan politics, because both political parties get the campaign contributions from the same corporations and the same rich donors. So a lot of what looks like rivalry between the Democrats and Republicans is more about personalities. Both parties actually respond to the same financial interests to a very large extent. It's very surprising, because we talk about polarization, but it's not really polarization between the parties, it's between the rich and the poor. And this isn't reflected in our politics very well. I think over time, the role of China and India and others in the world economy will grow, and the relative role of the US dollar will decline. Also, the American policymakers have been very destructive about the role of the dollar because they have used the dollar in a very militarized way. For example, confiscating the foreign exchange reserves of Russia, $300 billion. I think this is completely wrong. If you want other countries to use your currency, you don't confiscate those reserves. So I think the US policymakers have made very big mistakes in militarizing the dollar, because the means of payments should not be politicized this way. It should be a technical operation. So I personally believe that the renminbi will play a much larger role in the future. I believe that the rupee will play a larger role, the ruble, and others. And I think that's fine, but what Professor Li is saying is absolutely right. It should not come in the context of a big global crisis. It should be part of an evolutionary change in the international system. But I think it's a change in the right direction, actually. No one country is going to dominate the world economic or geopolitical system, no matter what they think. It's going to be a multipolar system and a multi-currency system as well.
Well, Professor Li also mentioned that default of the US dollar would be catastrophic for the world economy. So in your opinion, what hedging strategies make sense for China going forward?
Well, for China, the most important thing, I believe, is to clearly communicate China's intention, long-term intention to the U.S. counterparts, the U.S. scholars, U.S. policymakers, U.S. politicians, U.S. financial community, that China seeks to achieve international prosperity, rather than China's own prosperity at the expense of other countries' economic prosperity. So the case point is for China to coordinate closely on the issue of the internationalization of the RMB. Okay, so I strongly hold that view, and in China, domestically, I often make that argument, and internationally, I make the same argument. There's no difference between domestically and internationally. And on this regard, I believe Professor Sachs and I hold the same view. And then let me push Professor Jeffrey Sachs one step further. Okay, you argued, which I agree, that U.S. needs a reform of the campaign, a campaign reform, reducing the influence of certain groups of the society in the campaign process. Now, I think, please correct me whether I'm relevant here or not. Okay, seems to me that an alternative, perhaps an easier alternative to a campaign reform, is to have a reform of government agency, specifically to elevate the Congressional Budgetary Office to the level of U.S. Fed, to the level of even the U.S. Supreme Justice, the Supreme Court. Let it become really powerful and independent and professionally managed institution to manage many of the budgetary issues. In other words, to take some of the budgetary issues away from the popularly elected politicians. You know, many of them, I often joke to my Chinese friends, you know, Jeff, this is a fact, okay? This is not a lack of respect for the U.S. political system. And, you know, a small district in China in terms of population can elect a U.S. congressman. Now, how can we expect a U.S. congressman being elected from a small community be able to be knowledgeable and to be able very discretionary, very competent in discussing international and domestic issues. Okay, so of course they are wonderful. They are close to their voters. They do community service. Wonderful. But when it comes to international issues and the financial issues and budgetary issues, they may not be on the same page as professional experts and the economists and the financial experts. Okay, so this is so Jeff, I would like to hear your feedback. Whether I'm too far away from U.S. reality.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the political role of the budget process is very, very deep in the U.S. political and constitutional framework. So it can't really become like an independent central bank to have an independent budget process without really a break of our political system, which I don't believe is going to be conducive to normal outcomes. What happened in the United States, though, is that things got worse in two ways over the last 40 years. On the one hand, the role of campaign financing, which is a kind of corruption, became much more important. And this has really weakened the American political framework. And it's a series of deliberate actions that were taken that corrupted American politics. So this is something that needs to be addressed. The second thing that is absolutely also true is that governance became much more complicated. We have to think longer term. We have to make longer term plans. We don't have an NDRC. We don't have a National Development and Reform Commission like China that is a planning agency. We don't have any long-term plans in the United States by and large, other than perhaps the Pentagon, but even that is not really long-term plan. So governance became more complicated and the political system became more corrupted. This is a big problem. It's mainly a US problem, but US problems can spill over to be whole global problems. So I think we shouldn't expect fundamental dimensions of China's statecraft or US statecraft or any other country's statecraft necessarily to change, because our whole budget process is part of our political history. But we need to understand we're in a new era, that we need to be a lot more serious about how we think ahead and a lot more honest about how we make decisions for the common good. This, I would say, is the major challenge facing the United States right now. Its political system needs upgrading, but it's going to remain somehow in the longer tradition of American political history, which actually dates even from British political history. So we're kind of a child of Britain. And so our budget framework is hundreds of years in the making, but it definitely needs retuning right now.
Yeah, Jeff, I remember you have been arguing this for many years, which I agree. You wrote a book which is called The Price of Civilization. Am I right in citing the book?
Exactly. Thank you very much. That's a decade ago. I said exactly, we need a new budget framework. That was 10 years ago. And by the way, 3 years ago, I wrote a book called A New Foreign Policy, saying we need a new foreign policy framework that would be a lot less expensive and a lot fewer wars as well, based on cooperation of the US and China. So I think we're in the same direction very much.
Very good. Thank you.
Well, I think China and the U.S. certainly have a lot to communicate and learn from each other to make the world economy more stable and more prosperous. So, Professor Sachs, what is your perspective on recent developments related to currency multipolarity? For example, the BRICS are actively promoting local currency settlement, and what would be the impact on the U.S. economy?
I think that the direction of multi-currency makes sense for two major reasons. One is that the United States wasn't responsible in its management of the dollar. And so many other countries are saying we can't rely on the dollar. We can't rely on it politically, and we can't even rely on it technically, because the United States has made some very major technical mistakes, for instance, the one that caused the 2008 financial crisis. So this is one reason. The second is technology. Digital settlements will mean that it's much easier, in my opinion, to go to multi-currency systems, because we don't need the banks the same way to make the settlement. So it was the US dollar banking system, the SWIFT payment system, that kept the dollar so central to an important extent. But digital currencies, I think, will change that. Countries will be able to trade in and settle transactions much more easily than in the past with digital currencies. So for both of these reasons, we're moving to a multi-currency system. What does it mean for the United States? It means a tougher life, because it was a privilege to have the dollar at the center of the system. You could borrow almost for free. You could print money almost without worry in the short run. And the U.S. got used to that privilege. It got lazy, and it's going to pay a price when that privilege diminishes over time. And many of my colleagues say, no, you're completely wrong, Jeff. The dollar is going to remain dominant for decades to come. For example, Paul Krugman, a well-known economist and Nobel laureate, says, no, the dollar is going to remain dominant. I don't believe it. I think in 10 years, the international monetary system, as short as that, in 10 years, is going to look quite different.
Professor Li, what is your outlook of trade settlement in other currencies, the diversification from the US dollar?
Well, first, I agree with Professor Sachs that there will be multiple currencies emerging faster, perhaps, than Professor Krugman's expected. Okay. Meanwhile, let's face the reality, which I think will be reality. That is, despite the emergence of many currencies, they are eventually might be 2 or 3, I would say no more than 5 currencies, which will be anchors. Let's call them anchor currencies. Because why? Because if you have 20 currencies in international trade, fundamentally people will have to deal with the exchange rate risks, which will become extremely difficult. In my mind, down the road, in 10 years, maybe 15 or 20 years, there will be 3, no more than 5 anchor currencies emerging, which will have direct and very unpleasant implications for the U.S. So I do hope for the interest of the U.S. economy, for the interest of American consumers and investors and the companies, and also for the interest of the international economy, the world economy. Let's face the reality. Let's wake up. Let's hope the process of the transition from U.S. dollar to multiple anchor, 3 or 4 anchor currency system is not a crisis. It's not a catastrophe. So let's wake up. Jeff, I haven't talked to Paul Krugman for many years. Next time, if I meet him, the first thing I discuss is this issue.
Yes, very good.
Well, Professor Sachs, let's talk a bit about China-U.S. relations, because China is the big stakeholder in this. But despite rising geopolitical tensions, the Chinese and the U.S. economies remain closely interdependent. There are $700 billion of trade, and there are $250 billion of U.S. investment in China, and China is also the second largest holder of U.S. treasuries. But there is so much misunderstanding. There are even views in the U.S. that China may weaponize its holding of U.S. treasuries. Does it make any sense to you? Because because the stability of the U.S. financial markets is in the interest of China.
All of this tension results, in my view, from China's success, especially China's success over the last 20 years. China's had remarkable 40 years of economic development that's unprecedented in how successful, but in the last 20 years, China became very successful in high technology in a number of areas. And this is what caused panic even among American strategists, not economists, by the way. The economists are pretty calm about this, but it's those that are in the Pentagon or in the security services. I don't think like they do. I like China's prosperity very much, and I think there's enough room in the world for everybody to be prosperous, and I believe in common prosperity. But when you're a military strategist, you don't care about common prosperity, you care about who's number one, which is, to my mind, a wrong question to begin with, and a very dangerous perspective, because then you're fighting against the success of someone else. And it came to American politics in the last 10 years that we need to fight against China's success. Well, that's a terrible idea, a very dangerous idea. But I know that some American strategists or politicians believe in it. I think they're fools, frankly, if I could use a very strong term, because it's absolutely reckless. And when we're trained as economists, we think win-win. But when you're a military strategist, you might think win-lose. And I believe we should be aiming for win-win solutions, which I firmly believe in. But this is what's wrong with the mindset right now. And I think the biggest problem is on the U.S. side, because the U.S. strategists believe in American strategic dominance. It's part of our so-called grand strategy, which is a big term to mean a kind of arrogance. But we need to get over that arrogance to move to a much more cooperative mindset. How to do that, my view, is basically through diplomacy and discussion, lots of discussion, lots of interaction. The idea that the United States is going to starve China's economy by cutting off semiconductors is reckless and very naive, in my opinion. China will be able to find its way around these sanctions, and they are rather destructive of the economy at the same time. So I'm hoping that cooler heads, less panicked people, more economists believing in win-win, fewer geopolitical strategists believing in win-lose come to the fore.
Professor Li, what is your comment on this? Why do China and the U.S. have to be in this game of zero-sum?
Yeah, I fully agree with Professor Sachs' analysis. Let me add one, I think, simple point from China. That is, I do believe that there is a task to be accomplished by scholars like me who are fortunate to be educated both in China and in the West, in my case in particular in the US, okay? That is to explain to the American society at large, and also in particular to ordinary people on the street, that China is not a mirror image of the US. Today's China is not the emerging US at the beginning of the 20th century, okay? So when China does not have a history of to become a hegemony, when China becomes powerful, okay? China is not a country trying to impose its political, ideological belief system upon other countries, partly because the Chinese political and the social political philosophies are in my view, much more complicated to explain to other countries. So how can we expect other countries to follow the Chinese system? Okay, so in this regard, I have been working very hard, and Jeff, I need your help. I finished a book, and it's been in the process of being published by a U.S. publisher. I need you to help me write a few lines of endorsement. The simple line of message, the one line message is the rise of China is good for the world. Rise of China is good for the rest of the world. It's the opposite of what is popularly perceived. I meant this book to be read by people on the street. I tell many stories. Of course, I also explain the big picture of the Chinese economy, Chinese society. So Jeff, I hope you can help me in this regard.
Oh, I'm really excited about that because it's very important. It's the right message. Americans cannot imagine. China never had an empire abroad. Never went for world empire. Never. China never invaded its neighbors the same way. Never. I looked at 2,000 years of Chinese history. China never invaded Japan, for example, except when the Mongols were briefly in charge, when they tried and failed. But it's amazing, 2,000 years, and it's peace. And never in invasion. China was invaded the other direction. But this is something Americans can't even understand, because if you look at France and England, for example, and Britain, they invaded each other so many times over 1,000 years, it was almost nonstop war. And so Americans can't understand China's statecraft unless they learn more about it and more of the history. And so your book will be very important for that.
Professor Sachs, how difficult do you think it is to convey the message that China's rise is good for the U.S.?
I think we need much more communication than we have right now, and it's very weird. It's so easy as we're talking right now. We can get online and have a good conversation, but how rare this is, actually, it's very surprising, because we should have people in Des Moines, Iowa, meeting with people in Chongqing and having a nice conversation together. We should have normal conversations between Americans and Chinese people, athletes or people in the arts or academics, as a very routine matter. Our students should work together on projects online in classrooms that are shared, because this is the brilliance of the digital age, how much more we could communicate. But the communication is very low, surprisingly. And we just hear, in my country, I hear stupid politicians that don't know anything about China telling us that China's the enemy. And I hear that all the time. And these are people that I don't know if they've ever been to China once, but they are our politicians. And this, I think, is where the paradox is, that in an interconnected age, we don't have very many interconnections right now. And if we made more interconnections, not just business deals, but people-to-people understanding, this would be a huge benefit, because then we could tell our politicians in my country, calm down, don't panic, stop. China's not going to take over the world or take over the United States. You can calm down. And this, I think, would be extremely important.
Yeah, Jeff, let me add. Okay, Jeff, you have been extremely successful and effective in bringing U.S. perspective to the Chinese audience. You are very popular in China. So I admire you. I emulate. I try to emulate your success. If I could be fractionally successful as you are in Des Moines, Iowa, I would be very happy. Okay, I blame myself. Okay, I blame myself. I should be more active in that regard. I do need your help. I will go after you. I will send you an email after this.
We're going to work on that.
Thank you.
Well, thanks to both of you to promoting more communication between the two countries. And we know the world economy faces headwinds from rising U.S. interest rate and stronger dollar amid slowing growth. Professor Sachs, looking ahead, what is your economic outlook and what risks concern you the most?
If we want to have good sailing on the world economy, we should end the war in Ukraine now through negotiation, and we should calm down the U.S.-China tensions. If those two things happen, the world economy is going to look so much brighter than it does right now. And so these are two very practical steps. They're not even economic steps per se. They are more geopolitical steps. But if the United States and Europe would figure out finally that they need to sit down with Russia, with the government, make peace with Ukraine, European Union, United States, Russia, to end the war. This would change things tremendously, especially in Europe, but also worldwide. And if the US and Chinese leadership would say, okay, we're going to cooperate, we're not going to decouple, we're not going to threaten the world economy, this would change the business outlook tremendously. There's so much uncertainty that has been created needlessly because of the tensions, that this is really the key. You know, there are the usual economic problems. There still is the instabilities that came from COVID. Our monetary instability right now and inflation is a kind of aftermath of monetary policies that occurred in the United States at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. But those are manageable as long as the broader framework is peaceful and cooperative. And, you know, again, the politicians are not very good at economics. The geopolitical strategists, so-called, didn't take a proper economics course. I know it in the United States. They have wrong ideas. They have win-lose ideas. So peace is really the key to making the world economy work properly.
Indeed, Professor Sachs, I know you said there is no fairy tale ending to the Ukraine crisis. In your opinion, how feasible could this going to end in reality?
Right now, it's extremely dangerous these days and these weeks, but there is a basic way for this war to end. At the core of this crisis was the U.S. attempt to push its military alliance to Ukraine. And for Russia, that was a red line. We don't want NATO on our 2,000-kilometer border. And the United States said, yes, we will expand NATO to your border. And Russia said no. And that is the core of why there is a war. And what the United States needs to do, I believe, is President Biden needs to call President Putin and say, you know what, we won't extend NATO to your border. You will stop the fighting and go home. We won't enter into Ukraine. We'll make a deal so that Ukraine becomes peaceful, neutral, and safe. And on that basis, this war could end quickly, actually. But it takes the mindset to decide that. And incidentally, that's what would save Ukraine itself, because Ukraine is a country that is trapped in a proxy war of two superpowers. That's the worst thing to be. Yeah. You don't want to be in between two superpowers. And so Ukraine they don't understand it, or for various political reasons, they don't accept it, but they should be the first to be saying, we will be neutral, we want both sides to get out so that we are neutral and safe, and that's how this war could end.
Right, we hope we can see more people like you or who are waking up to this idea. We know that Robert Kennedy recently raised this point about NATO's expansion is unacceptable for Russia and they need to negotiate. Professor Li, what is your comment on this? What risks concern you the most for the world economy to remain on the recovering trajectory?
Yeah, first, I fully agree with Jeff's point. which is actually a fundamental piece of wisdom, that is the best way for a mid-power or a small country to be peaceful, to be prosperous, is to stay neutral among the big powers, just like Switzerland. Switzerland did, just like somehow Sweden did in history. Okay. Anyway, so in addition to what Jeff has just made, let me make a very simple, very obvious point, that both the Chinese and the US economies are huge. Okay, together we account for 43% of the global economy. Okay, so if both China and the US handle their domestic economic financial affairs properly, the world economy will be much better. Okay, now how to do that? Very simple. If you want me to be very simple, on TV, to make things very super simple. Okay. The most important homework for the US to do right now is to make sure its financial system to restore stability before long. Okay, the US economy per se, frankly speaking, is still very strong. Job numbers are adding, innovation are still being made. Okay, however, the banking sector, the financial system is not stable. So do your homework. Make sure your financial system is stable, not only for the U.S. economy per se, but also for the rest of the world. Okay. Second, for China, make sure economic growth is maintained and restored. The post-pandemic problems are resolved. The economic growth is maintained. I'm talking about more than 5.3%. In my mind, I have a target of 5.3, 5.5% for this year. Frankly speaking, the Chinese economy is not recovering as fast as many economists, including myself, have expected. So we have our homework to do in China. In my view, we need to stimulate consumption a little bit. We need to stabilize the property market. We need also to resolve part of this, some of the local government's debt. These are the three arrows the Chinese economy needs to shoot.
And both the United States and China have enormous responsibility to stabilize the world economy and promote recovery. Well, that's all the time we have today. Many thanks again to our esteemed guests, Professor Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University and Professor Li Daokui from Tsinghua University. So this timely discussion has highlighted risks and policy imperatives that demand urgent action to place the U.S. and global debt levels on a sustainable footing, and forging cooperation between the world's two largest economies will go a long way toward averting considerable threats to our economic and financial stability. And that would do it for this edition of BizTalk on CGTN. Thank you for being with us. Until next time, bye for now.